Get comfortable and settle in. Tonight you're going to fall asleep to one of the most ridiculous stories in history. Picture this. It's the year 1045, somewhere in medieval Rome. The most powerful man in all of Europe is frantically applying makeup. He's stuffing fake breasts into a dress. He's practicing his feminine walk in front of a mirror. No, this isn't some bizarre fever dream you're having after eating too much cheese before bed. This actually happened. And the man desperately trying to perfect his drag queen routine was none other than the Pope himself. Let your mind drift as I tell you about Pope Benedict IX. A man whose solution to political problems was apparently to raid the papal wardrobe for the most convincing nun outfit he could find. Now, I know what you're thinking as you're getting sleepy. Another boring history lesson about dusty old books and dead people in funny hats, right? Wrong. This story has absolutely everything. Corruption that would make modern politicians blush. Political intrigue worthy of Game of Thrones. Cross-dressing that puts RuPaul to shame. Narrow escapes through dark medieval streets. And enough scandal to keep gossip columnists busy for decades. We're talking about a pope who was so spectacularly terrible at his job that he managed to get kicked out of Rome not once, not twice, but multiple times. His brilliant escape plan involved becoming medieval Europe's first documented papal drag performer. Benedict IX wasn't just any pope either. This was a young man barely in his 20s. He bought his way into the papacy through family connections and bribery. Then he proceeded to turn the Vatican into what historians politely call a den of iniquity. What we might more accurately describe as medieval Europe's most exclusive and corrupt nightclub. He threw parties that would make ancient Roman emperors proud. He sold church positions to the highest bidder. He generally behaved like a cross between a mafia boss and a spoiled teenager with unlimited credit cards. But here's where our story gets truly fascinating. As you let yourself relax and drift into this incredible tale. By 1045, Benedict had pushed the Roman people so far past their breaking point. They were literally marching on the Vatican with torches and pitchforks, screaming for his head. The most powerful man in the Christian world found himself trapped. Supposedly God's representative on earth, trapped in his own palace with an angry mob outside. No escape route. Absolutely no friends left in the entire city. So what did he do? Did he face his accusers with dignity? Did he call upon divine intervention? Did he at least try to negotiate? Absolutely not. Instead, this brilliant leader of the Catholic Church decided that his best option was to put on a dress, some makeup, and sneak out of Rome disguised as a woman. Think about that for a moment as you close your eyes. The man who was supposed to be the moral compass for all of Christendom. The spiritual leader of millions of faithful Catholics. The person who claimed to speak directly with God. He chose to handle his political crisis by becoming a cross-dressing fugitive. And the most amazing part? It actually worked. This is the true story of the night when the Pope became a drag queen. When the Vatican's halls echoed with the click of high heels instead of sandals. When the leader of the Catholic Church proved that sometimes the best way to solve your problems is to embrace your feminine side. And run like hell. Now, to truly appreciate just how insane this story is, you need to understand what Rome was like in the 11th century. And trust me, as you drift deeper into relaxation, this context will make our Pope's cross-dressing adventure even more incredible. This wasn't the Rome of gladiators and Caesar. That glorious empire had crumbled centuries ago. This was medieval Rome, a shadow of its former self. Picture a city where wild grass grew through the cracks of ancient marble floors, where goats grazed in what used to be the Forum, where the Colosseum had become a fortress for local warlords. The population had shrunk from over 1 million people to maybe 30,000. Most of the grand buildings were either ruins or had been converted into crude medieval fortresses. It was basically a large, very fancy ghost town. But here's the thing about medieval Rome. It still had one major claim to power: the Pope. The Bishop of Rome wasn't just any religious figure. He was supposed to be the direct successor to St. Peter, Christ's own chosen representative, the spiritual leader of all Western Christianity. And in an age when everyone believed that kings ruled by divine right, the Pope was the guy who supposedly handed out that divine approval. Think of him as medieval Europe's ultimate authority figure. Kings would literally travel hundreds of miles just to kiss his ring. Emperors would wait outside in the snow for days, begging for forgiveness. The Pope could declare wars holy. He could excommunicate entire kingdoms. He could basically ruin your afterlife with a single decree. It was the ultimate power trip. But here's where things get interesting as you let your mind wander through these medieval streets. The papacy in the 11th century had become completely, utterly corrupt. We're talking about a level of corruption that would make modern politicians look like choir boys. The papal throne wasn't earned through piety or theological brilliance. It was bought and sold like a used chariot. Wealthy families would literally purchase the position for their younger sons. Sometimes they'd fight wars over who got to be pope next. There were periods when multiple people claimed to be the real pope simultaneously. Imagine 3 different guys all insisting they were God's chosen representative, all excommunicating each other, all demanding that kings and emperors pick sides. It was religious chaos. The papal court had become a den of political scheming, sexual scandals, financial corruption, nepotism so blatant it would make a mafia family blush. Popes were selling church positions to the highest bidder. They were living in luxury while preaching poverty. They were having affairs, throwing orgies, and generally behaving like they'd never read the Bible. And the Roman people? They were getting fed up. These weren't ignorant peasants either. Romans had a long tradition of knowing exactly how to deal with corrupt leaders. They remembered their ancestors who had overthrown emperors, who had burned palaces, who had dragged tyrants through the streets. The citizens of Rome had been watching pope after pope abuse their power, steal from the church treasury, live like kings while ordinary people struggled to survive. By the 1040s, the tension in the city was like a pot of water about to boil over. People were whispering in the markets, plotting in the taverns, gathering in secret meetings. The stage was set for revolution, and right in the middle of this powder keg sat our protagonist, Pope Benedict IX. A young man who was about to prove that when it comes to corruption and scandal, he could outdo all of his predecessors combined. A pope so spectacularly bad at his job that he would soon have the entire city of Rome baying for his blood. Which brings us to the question: how exactly does someone become so hated that cross-dressing becomes their best escape plan? Let your mind drift back to the year 1032, a time when most 20-year-olds were learning trades or getting married. But one particular young man was about to become the most powerful religious figure in the world. Meet Theophylactus of Tusculum, better known to history as Pope Benedict IX. And yes, you heard that right. 20 years old. Some historians think he might have been even younger. Possibly 18. Maybe even 16 when he first put on the papal crown. Imagine handing ultimate spiritual authority to a teenager. This is like making a college freshman the CEO of the world's largest corporation. Except instead of running a business, he was supposedly running people's eternal souls. So how exactly does a teenager become pope? Well, it helps when your family basically owns the papacy. Benedict was a member of the powerful Tusculani family. Think of them as medieval Rome's version of a political dynasty. His father was Alberic III, a man who controlled much of the territory around Rome through a combination of wealth, violence, and strategic marriages. His uncle had been Pope John XIX. His great-uncle had been Pope Benedict VIII. The papacy was essentially the family business, and young Benedict was next in line for the throne. But here's the thing about giving ultimate power to a spoiled rich kid. It rarely ends well. Benedict IX wasn't just young. He was completely unprepared for the responsibility. He had never shown any particular interest in theology. He'd never demonstrated any signs of piety or spiritual calling. He was basically a medieval trust fund baby who suddenly found himself in charge of the Catholic Church. And he approached the job exactly like you'd expect a wealthy teenager to approach unlimited power, with absolutely no sense of responsibility whatsoever. From the moment he became pope, Benedict treated the Vatican like his personal playground. He threw parties that scandalized even the notoriously corrupt Roman nobility. We're talking about gatherings that made ancient Roman orgies look like church picnics. Contemporary chroniclers wrote about papal banquets where more wine was spilled than most people drank in a year, where the entertainment was so shocking that even hardened Roman politicians blushed. Picture the Vatican filled with the sound of laughter, music, and debauchery echoing through halls that were supposed to be sacred. Benedict didn't just ignore his religious duties. He actively mocked them. He would show up to important ceremonies drunk. He'd interrupt serious theological discussions with crude jokes. He once allegedly tried to sell the papacy itself to his godfather for a hefty sum of gold. When that deal fell through, he reportedly considered auctioning off individual church positions to whoever brought the most entertaining bribes. This wasn't just corruption. This was corruption with style and arrogance. Benedict seemed to take genuine pleasure in shocking people. He would deliberately break religious rules just to see how far he could push things. He kept mistresses openly in the papal palace. He appointed his friends and drinking buddies to important church positions. He used church funds to throw elaborate hunting parties. He even had the papal guards stage mock battles for his entertainment. But perhaps most telling of all was his attitude toward the Roman people themselves. Benedict genuinely seemed to believe that being pope made him untouchable. That divine authority meant he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. He treated the citizens of Rome like his personal subjects. He taxed them heavily to fund his lifestyle. He ignored their complaints about corruption in the church. He dismissed their concerns about his behavior as the jealous whining of inferior people. This teenage pope had somehow convinced himself that God approved of his actions, that being young and powerful meant the normal rules didn't apply to him, that he could live like a king while preaching about poverty and humility. But there was one thing Benedict IX hadn't counted on. The people of Rome had centuries of experience dealing with tyrants, and they were very, very good at revolution. Our young pope was about to learn that even divine authority has its limits, especially when you're too busy partying to notice that the entire city is starting to turn against you. Now, as you settle deeper into comfort, let me paint you a picture of just how spectacularly corrupt the papal court had become under Benedict IX. We're not talking about your garden variety political corruption here. This was corruption raised to an art form. Corruption so blatant and shameless that it would make modern scandal-ridden politicians weep with envy. Benedict had turned the Vatican into what historians politely call a center of simony. But what that really means is that literally everything in the Catholic Church was for sale. Everything. Want to become a bishop? That'll be 50 pounds of gold, please. Need a marriage annulment? The Pope's taking bribes this Tuesday. Want your sins forgiven without all that tedious confession nonsense? Benedict had a price list hanging on his office wall. It was like spiritual Amazon, except instead of free shipping, you got a guarantee that your soul would be saved. The Pope had essentially turned salvation into a luxury commodity, and business was booming. Let me give you some specifics that will help your mind drift into this bizarre medieval world. Benedict would literally auction off church positions during his dinner parties. Picture this scene. The Pope, barely old enough to shave properly, standing on a table in the papal dining hall. A goblet of wine in one hand. A list of available bishop positions in the other. Do I hear 60 gold pieces for the Diocese of Milan? 60? Anyone? How about we throw in a nice summer villa? No. Well, 50 then, but you have to promise to attend my hunting parties. This actually happened. Multiple times. Contemporary chroniclers recorded these scenes with a mixture of horror and fascination. But it gets even more ridiculous. Benedict didn't just sell church positions. He sold everything. Holy relics that were supposedly pieces of the true cross, available for the right price. Sacred oils that had been blessed by previous popes, on sale every Friday. Even the papal blessing itself became a commodity. Rich merchants would literally line up outside the Vatican with bags of gold, waiting to purchase Benedict's spiritual approval for their latest business ventures. The Pope had turned divine grace into a medieval marketplace. And here's where it gets really wild as you let your mind wander through these scandals. Benedict wasn't content with just selling church stuff. He started selling things that didn't even exist yet. He would promise future papal pardons for crimes that hadn't been committed. He'd sell people positions in the church hierarchy that he'd have to create later. He once allegedly sold the same bishop position to 3 different people on the same night. Then spent the next morning trying to figure out how to break the news to 2 very angry, very wealthy customers. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of Benedict's corruption was how open it all was. This wasn't happening in secret back rooms or hidden chambers. The Pope was conducting his corrupt business right out in the open. He would hold court in the papal palace, surrounded by merchants, politicians, and criminals, all negotiating deals for church positions and spiritual favors. It was like a bizarre religious stock exchange, where instead of trading commodities, people were buying and selling pieces of their eternal souls. The papal court had become so corrupt that legitimate church business almost couldn't get done. Serious theological matters were constantly interrupted by Benedict's wheeling and dealing. Important religious ceremonies were postponed because the Pope was busy haggling over the price of a monastery. Sacred church councils turned into bidding wars for the most influential positions. Meanwhile, the actual spiritual needs of the Catholic faithful were completely ignored. Churches throughout Europe were sending desperate letters to Rome, begging for guidance on important religious matters. These letters would sit unopened on Benedict's desk while he counted his latest profits from selling fake relics to gullible pilgrims. The Pope had literally forgotten that his job involved anything other than making money. And all of this was happening while ordinary Romans were struggling with poverty, disease, and the constant threat of war. They could see the papal palace glittering with wealth that had been stolen from church coffers. They could hear the sounds of lavish parties echoing through the Vatican while their own children went hungry. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. And it was about to explode. Let your mind drift into the narrow streets of medieval Rome, where something dangerous was beginning to stir. By 1044, the Roman people had reached their breaking point. And when Romans get angry, history has taught us that very bad things tend to happen to whoever made them angry. The first signs of revolt weren't dramatic. They never are. Revolutions don't start with grand declarations or armies marching through the streets. They start with whispered conversations in dark corners, with angry glances exchanged in the marketplace, with people who used to bow their heads when the Pope passed by, now spitting on the ground instead. Benedict IX was too busy counting his corrupt profits to notice any of this, of course, but the signs were everywhere if you knew how to look. Roman shopkeepers started refusing to sell goods to papal officials. Tavern owners would mysteriously run out of wine whenever Vatican representatives showed up. Church services began to empty out whenever Benedict himself appeared to celebrate Mass. The people were voting with their feet, and their wallets, and their increasingly obvious contempt. Now, you have to understand something about medieval Romans. These weren't just any ordinary medieval citizens. These were the direct descendants of the people who had built the greatest empire in human history, who had conquered most of the known world, who had a long, proud tradition of dealing with corrupt leaders in very permanent ways. They remembered stories passed down through generations about how their ancestors had handled tyrants. And those stories usually ended with the tyrant in question being dragged through the streets by an angry mob. The grumbling started in the markets. Merchants who had been forced to pay ever-increasing taxes to fund Benedict's lifestyle began complaining openly. "That boy Pope," they would mutter while weighing their goods. "Living like an emperor while we can barely feed our families." Food vendors started sharing stories about papal servants showing up to demand free provisions for yet another lavish Vatican party, while ordinary Romans were scraping together coins just to buy bread. The anger was spreading like wildfire through the city's tight-knit neighborhoods. Then the story started getting more specific and more scandalous. People began talking about what they'd seen through the windows of the papal palace. The drunken parties that lasted for days. The gambling sessions where church relics were used as betting chips. The parade of questionable characters who seemed to have unlimited access to the Pope's chambers. Romans love gossip almost as much as they love revolution. And the gossip about Benedict was getting juicier by the day. But perhaps most infuriating of all were the broken promises. Benedict had initially presented himself as a reformer, a young, energetic pope who would clean up the corruption of his predecessors. He'd made grand speeches about returning the church to its spiritual roots, about caring for the poor and downtrodden, about being a pope for all people, not just the wealthy elite. Instead, he turned out to be worse than any of his corrupt predecessors. At least the previous popes had tried to hide their corruption somewhat. Benedict flaunted it. He seemed to take genuine pleasure in showing ordinary Romans just how little he cared about their opinion. The breaking point came during the winter of 1044, a particularly harsh winter when many Roman families were struggling to survive. While people were literally freezing in their homes, Benedict threw what contemporary sources describe as the most lavish party in papal history. The celebrations went on for a week. The sounds of music and laughter echoed through the Vatican while Roman children cried from hunger in the streets below. That's when the protests started. Small at first. Groups of angry citizens gathering outside the papal palace, shouting complaints about corruption and demanding reform. Benedict's response was to have his guards disperse the crowds with violence. Big mistake. Nothing radicalizes a population faster than being beaten for exercising their right to complain. The protests grew larger, and angrier, and more organized. Roman citizens who had never agreed on anything before suddenly found themselves united by their hatred of their teenage pope. They started holding secret meetings in taverns and private homes, planning, organizing, preparing for something bigger. Benedict IX was about to learn a lesson that many powerful leaders throughout history have learned the hard way. When you push people too far, they eventually push back. And when Romans push back, they don't mess around. As you drift deeper into this medieval drama, picture the shadowy halls of Roman noble palaces, where something far more dangerous than street protests was beginning to take shape. While ordinary Romans were openly grumbling about their corrupt pope, the city's powerful families were doing something much more sinister. They were plotting. And when Roman nobles plot against you, it's time to start updating your will. These weren't just any nobles either. We're talking about families who had been playing the deadly game of Roman politics for centuries, who had survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire, who had watched emperors rise and fall, who knew exactly how to remove inconvenient leaders from power permanently. The most powerful of these families were the Crescentii, ancient rivals of Benedict's own Tusculani clan. They had been quietly seething ever since Benedict's family had monopolized the papacy. Think of it as a medieval version of a corporate takeover. Except instead of hostile buyouts, they used actual hostility. With swords. Benedict had made a crucial error that would cost him dearly. He had assumed that being pope made him untouchable. That divine authority meant earthly politics couldn't touch him. But he had forgotten a basic rule of medieval survival. In Rome, family politics trumped everything else, including God. The conspiracy began in the Palazzo of Crescentius III, the head of the Crescentii family and a man who had been waiting decades for an opportunity to destroy the Tusculani. Picture this scene as you let your mind wander through these marble halls. A dimly lit chamber filled with Rome's most powerful men. Maps of the city spread across ancient tables. Whispered conversations about guard rotations and escape routes. These weren't amateurs planning a peasant uprising. These were professionals planning a coup. The nobles had several advantages that the street protesters lacked. Money, private armies, political connections throughout Italy, and most importantly, they knew exactly how the papal court operated, because many of them had been part of it. Some had even helped Benedict rise to power in the first place. Now they were planning to tear him down using the same methods. The conspiracy spread through Rome's elite like wine through expensive cloth. Each noble family brought something different to the plot. The Orsini provided intelligence about papal security. The Colonna offered safe houses throughout the city. The Frangipane controlled key bridges and fortifications. It was like a medieval Ocean's 11. Except instead of robbing a casino, they were planning to rob the Pope of his throne. But here's what made this conspiracy truly dangerous. The nobles weren't just motivated by political ambition. They were genuinely outraged by Benedict's behavior. These were men who took their Catholic faith seriously, who believed that the Pope should be a moral leader, who were horrified by what Benedict had done to the sacred office. Their anger gave the conspiracy a righteous fury that made it incredibly dangerous. The plotting intensified throughout 1044. Secret messages were passed between palazzos using trusted servants and coded languages. Weapons were quietly stockpiled in hidden locations throughout the city. Gold was distributed to buy the loyalty of key guards and officials. The nobles were preparing for war. And they were doing it right under Benedict's nose. The young pope was completely oblivious to the danger surrounding him. He was too busy enjoying his corrupt lifestyle to notice that his own supporters were abandoning him. Too distracted by his latest money-making schemes to see that powerful enemies were circling like vultures. Too arrogant to believe that anyone would dare challenge God's chosen representative. Meanwhile, the conspirators were making contact with the street protesters, offering organization, leadership, resources. The gap between elite discontent and popular anger was rapidly closing. And when that gap closed completely, Benedict IX would find himself facing something no amount of papal authority could protect him from. A united Rome demanding his head. The conspiracy was nearly ready to move. The pieces were all in place. The timing had been carefully calculated. All they needed now was the right moment to strike. And that moment was coming sooner than anyone imagined, including Benedict himself. Let your mind settle into the spring of 1045, when everything began to unravel for our young pope. Picture Rome like a pot of water that had been simmering for months and was finally starting to boil over. Benedict IX was about to discover that there's a limit to how much corruption and arrogance even medieval Romans will tolerate. And he was about to cross that limit in spectacular fashion. The breaking point came during Easter week, the most sacred time in the Christian calendar, when even the most corrupt pope should have been able to manage some basic dignity and reverence. Instead, Benedict decided this was the perfect time to throw what contemporary chroniclers describe as the most scandalous party in papal history. We're talking about a celebration that made his previous excesses look like children's tea parties. The Easter festivities at the Vatican lasted for 6 days straight. 6 days of non-stop drinking, gambling, and debauchery. While Christians throughout Europe were observing solemn religious ceremonies, their spiritual leader was hosting what was essentially a medieval rave in the holiest building in Christendom. The sounds of raucous laughter and drunken singing echoed through St. Peter's Basilica. Ancient sacred vessels were used as drinking cups. Religious artifacts became props in drinking games. It was sacrilege on an industrial scale. But Benedict wasn't content with just throwing a scandalous party. He decided to make it a fundraiser too. Entrance to the papal celebrations required a hefty donation to the church. Well, technically to Benedict's personal treasury. He was literally charging admission to watch the Pope desecrate his own church. And people paid. because missing the Pope's party meant social and political suicide in medieval Rome. Meanwhile, outside the Vatican walls, ordinary Romans were celebrating Easter in the traditional way, with prayer, fasting, quiet reflection on the meaning of Christ's sacrifice. The contrast was impossible to ignore, and it was the final straw for many people who had been trying to give Benedict the benefit of the doubt. Here was concrete proof that their pope cared more about personal profit than religious devotion. The Roman nobility were horrified. Even the most corrupt among them understood that certain lines shouldn't be crossed. Desecrating Easter was one of those lines. Letters of complaint began arriving from bishops throughout Europe. Cardinals started quietly distancing themselves from the papal court. Even Benedict's own family began to worry that he was going too far. But the young pope was drunk on power and apparently actual wine as well. He dismissed all criticism as jealousy. He claimed that his enemies were trying to undermine the papacy itself. He even suggested that God approved of his lifestyle because he hadn't been struck down by lightning yet. This was not the response of a rational leader. This was the response of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The situation deteriorated rapidly after Easter. Roman merchants began refusing to do business with the Vatican entirely. Church officials from across Europe started boycotting papal ceremonies. Even the papal guards began showing signs of disloyalty. When your own bodyguards start giving you dirty looks, it's time to reassess your life choices. But Benedict was beyond reassessment. He was trapped in a spiral of escalating bad decisions. Each mistake led to more criticism, which led to more defensive arrogance, which led to even worse mistakes. It was like watching a very slow, very public nervous breakdown. By late spring 1045, Benedict's position had become completely untenable. He had no political support, no popular support, no international support. Even his own clergy were abandoning him. He controlled nothing beyond the immediate walls of the Vatican. And even that control was beginning to slip. The conspirators could sense that their moment had finally arrived. The street protesters were growing bolder by the day. Foreign powers were questioning Benedict's legitimacy. The papal treasury was nearly empty from funding his lifestyle. Every day that passed made his position weaker. And everyone in Rome could smell blood in the water. Benedict IX had painted himself into a corner from which there was no dignified escape. But as we'll see, dignity was never really his strong suit anyway. Now, as you let yourself drift into this climactic moment, picture the morning of September 20th, 1045. A date that would forever change the papacy. And our young pope's wardrobe choices. Benedict IX woke up in his luxurious papal chambers to the sound he had been dreading for months. The sound of an angry crowd. But this wasn't just another street protest that could be dispersed with a few guards. This was different. This was organized. This was serious. And this was very, very large. The conspiracy had finally moved from shadowy planning to open action. During the night, while Benedict slept off another evening of papal partying, Roman nobles had quietly positioned their private armies around the Vatican. The Crescentii forces controlled the main roads leading to St. Peter's. The Orsini had blocked the river crossings. The Colonna had seized the key bridges. It was a textbook medieval siege, executed with military precision. Meanwhile, thousands of ordinary Roman citizens had gathered in St. Peter's Square. But these weren't the usual complainers and protesters. These were people carrying weapons, torches, ropes, the kind of supplies you bring when you're planning to drag someone out of a building. Permanently. The crowd wasn't just angry anymore. They were organized. They had leaders. They had a plan. And that plan apparently involved getting their hands on the Pope. By any means necessary. Benedict's first clue that something was seriously wrong came when he tried to send servants out for his usual morning supplies. What? Expensive food. Fresh flowers for his chambers. But the servants came back empty-handed and terrified. "Holy Father," they stammered, "we cannot leave the city. It surrounds us." From his palace windows, Benedict could see the scope of the disaster. Every street leading to the Vatican was packed with hostile Romans. Every rooftop seemed to have archers positioned with arrows aimed at the papal palace. Every church bell in the city was ringing. Not in celebration. In warning. It was like the entire city of Rome had declared war on their pope. Which technically they had. The siege wasn't subtle or secretive. It was a public demonstration of just how thoroughly Benedict had lost the support of his people. Banners hung from buildings throughout the city. Down with the boy pope. Death to corruption. Rome for Romans. The messages were clear. And so was the intended outcome. Benedict's papal guards found themselves completely outnumbered. There were maybe 50 of them, against thousands of angry Romans. Many of the guards were Romans themselves, who had families in the crowd below, who shared the same anger about papal corruption, who were beginning to question exactly why they were protecting someone who had betrayed everything they believed in. Some guards quietly slipped away during the morning. Others simply refused orders to disperse the crowd. A few even opened palace gates to let protesters closer to the main buildings. Benedict's security was collapsing as quickly as his political support. By midday, the crowd had grown even larger. People were arriving from throughout the region. Farmers, merchants, pilgrims who had come to Rome seeking spiritual guidance and found corruption instead. The square outside St. Peter's was so packed that people could barely move. But they didn't need to move. They just needed to wait and make it clear that they weren't leaving until their demands were met. Those demands were simple. Benedict IX had to go. Permanently. No negotiations. No compromises. No promises of reform. The Roman people wanted their corrupt pope removed from power immediately, and they were prepared to remove him themselves if necessary. From his increasingly isolated palace, Benedict could hear the chants growing louder and more aggressive. Come out, false pope. Face your people. No more hiding. The crowd was calling him out like children daring a bully to fight. Except these children had weapons, and centuries of experience overthrowing unpopular leaders. For the first time in his pampered life, Benedict IX was beginning to understand that being pope didn't actually make him untouchable. That divine authority meant nothing against several thousand very angry Romans who had decided they'd had enough. The siege of the Vatican had begun, and our young pope was starting to realize that he might not survive it. As you settle deeper into this unfolding drama, picture our young pope finally beginning to grasp the reality of his situation. Benedict IX spent the first few hours of the siege in complete denial, pacing around his luxurious chambers, muttering about ungrateful subjects and temporary setbacks. Convinced that this was just another protest that would blow over if he waited long enough, he kept sending messages to his remaining supporters, demanding that they disperse the crowd, restore order, remind everyone who was really in charge here. But those messages kept coming back undelivered, because there was nobody left to deliver them to. The papal messengers couldn't get through the crowds. His political allies had mysteriously become unavailable. His family members were suddenly too busy to respond to his urgent requests for help. Benedict was learning the hardest lesson in politics. When you're really in trouble, you discover exactly how alone you actually are. The first crack in his denial came when he tried to celebrate morning mass in the Sistine Chapel. Benedict had always used religious ceremonies as opportunities to display his power and authority, to remind everyone that he was God's chosen representative. But when he entered the chapel that morning, he found it almost completely empty. A few terrified servants, a handful of clergy who were too scared to leave. The vast sacred space that should have been filled with worshippers echoed with the sounds of the angry crowd outside. Even his most loyal supporters had abandoned him. For the first time, Benedict began to understand that this wasn't just a temporary political crisis. This was the end of his papacy, possibly the end of his life. The second crack came when his captain of guards requested a private meeting. This was a man who had served the papal court for decades, who had sworn oaths of loyalty to protect the pope with his life, who should have been Benedict's most reliable defender. Instead, he delivered the most devastating news possible. "Holy Father," the captain said quietly, "my men, they will not fight Romans for you. Many have families in that crowd. They ask why they should protect someone who has brought shame to the church." Benedict stared at him in shock. But I am the Pope." They swore oaths. The captain shrugged. Oaths mean nothing when the man you serve has betrayed everything those oaths represented. That's when Benedict IX finally understood. He wasn't losing a political battle. He was experiencing a complete collapse of legitimacy. When your own guards won't defend you, when your own clergy won't stand with you, when the entire city wants you gone, papal authority becomes just empty words. The third and final crack came when he looked out his window and really saw the crowd for the first time. Really saw the faces. These weren't just angry protesters. These were people who felt betrayed, personally betrayed, by someone they had trusted to guide their spiritual lives. Some were holding up religious icons, crucifixes, pictures of previous popes, as if to remind Benedict what the papacy was supposed to represent. Others were displaying the fake relics they had purchased from him, the worthless pardons, the meaningless church positions, physical evidence of his corruption. But what scared Benedict most were the ropes. Lots of people in that crowd were carrying ropes. And in medieval times, ropes in the hands of angry crowds usually meant one thing: public execution. Suddenly, Benedict's luxurious papal chambers felt less like a palace and more like a very expensive prison. The walls that had protected him from consequences were now trapping him with those same consequences. Every door led to corridors filled with hostile Romans. Every window showed him more evidence of just how thoroughly he had lost control. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He was going to die, unless he could figure out a way to escape. But how do you escape when you're the most recognizable man in Rome? When your face is on coins? When you normally travel with elaborate processions and papal regalia? When every citizen in the city knows exactly what you look like? For the first time in his pampered life, Benedict IX had to think like a fugitive. And that's when the most desperate plan in papal history began to form in his terrified mind. Now, as your mind drifts into this moment of papal panic, picture Benedict IX frantically pacing his chambers like a caged animal. The most powerful man in medieval Europe was about to become the most desperate fugitive in Rome. And desperation, as we're about to see, can lead to some very creative solutions. Benedict's first escape ideas were predictably terrible. He considered trying to sneak out through the papal gardens. But the gardens were surrounded by angry Romans with torches. He thought about hiding in the Vatican's secret passages. But those passages all led to buildings that were also surrounded. He even briefly considered disguising himself as a priest, then realized that priests were exactly what people were looking for. Every conventional escape route was blocked. Every normal disguise would be useless. Benedict needed something so unexpected, so completely outside the realm of possibility, that nobody would ever think to look for it. That's when inspiration struck. Or perhaps desperation struck. It's hard to tell the difference when you're a panicked pope facing imminent death. The idea came to him while he was staring out his window at the crowd below, studying the faces of his enemies, trying to figure out how to slip past them unnoticed. And that's when he noticed something interesting. Roughly half the crowd was made up of women. Roman women who were just as angry as the men, just as determined to see him punished. But also, and this was the crucial detail, much less likely to be searched or questioned if they were seen leaving the area. Medieval Roman society had very strict ideas about gender roles. Men were public figures, political actors, potential threats. Women were private figures, domestic creatures, generally invisible to male authorities unless they were causing obvious trouble. A man trying to sneak through an angry crowd would be stopped, questioned, possibly recognized. But a woman? A woman could potentially walk right past the guards, right through the protesters, right out of Rome entirely, if she knew how to act the part. The more Benedict thought about it, the more brilliant the plan seemed. Nobody would ever expect the Pope to disguise himself as a woman. It was so absurd, so completely contrary to everything the papacy represented, so utterly humiliating for someone of his position, that it was actually perfect. But brilliant as the idea might be, the practical challenges were enormous. Benedict had spent his entire life being aggressively, performatively masculine. He was used to commanding attention, speaking with authority, moving through the world like he owned it, because technically he thought he did. Now he would need to learn how to be invisible, submissive, feminine, in a matter of hours. He would need to completely transform not just his appearance but his entire way of being. And he would need to do it convincingly enough to fool thousands of people who wanted him dead. The planning began immediately. Benedict called for his most trusted servant, a man who had been with the papal household for decades, who knew every secret passage in the Vatican, who could be counted on to keep his mouth shut about even the most scandalous papal activities. When the servant arrived, Benedict swore him to absolute secrecy, then explained the plan. The servant's face went through an entire range of emotions: shock, disbelief, horror, and finally grudging admiration. "It's completely insane, Holy Father," the servant whispered, "which is exactly why it might work." They began gathering the necessary materials: women's clothing from the papal household staff, makeup and cosmetics stolen from the chambers of visiting noble ladies, jewelry that could help complete the disguise, even padding for areas where Benedict's masculine anatomy might give him away. Each item was acquired carefully, secretly, without attracting attention from the remaining palace guards, who were already showing signs of divided loyalty. The escape route was planned in detail: secret passages that led to lesser-known exits, safe houses where Benedict could complete his transformation, contacts outside Rome who could provide shelter once he escaped the city. It was like planning a military operation. Except instead of attacking the enemy, they were running away from them. In drag. As night fell over the besieged Vatican, Benedict IX prepared for the most humiliating, most desperate, and most cross-dressing evening of his entire life. Let your mind drift into the papal chambers as night falls over Rome, where the most ridiculous makeover in religious history is about to begin. Picture this scene. The most powerful man in medieval Europe, standing in front of a mirror, while his terrified servant attempts to transform him into a convincing medieval woman. It's like a twisted fairy tale. Except instead of a pumpkin turning into a carriage, we have a pope turning into a drag queen. The transformation began with the basics. Benedict's distinctive papal robes had to go immediately. These elaborate garments were symbols of his authority, instantly recognizable to any Roman citizen. Instead, his servant brought out a simple woolen dress, the kind worn by middle-class Roman women. Not too fancy to attract attention, not too plain to seem suspicious, just completely, utterly ordinary. Which for someone like Benedict IX was probably the most exotic outfit he'd ever worn. But putting on a dress was just the beginning of his problems. Medieval women moved differently than men. They spoke differently. They carried themselves differently. Benedict had spent his entire life swaggering around like he owned the world. Now he needed to learn how to walk like someone who definitely didn't own anything, especially not a penis. The servant began with posture lessons. Smaller steps, Holy Father. Keep your knees together. Women don't stride. They glide. Benedict tried to glide. He looked like a duck with a leg injury. Perhaps we should practice this more, the servant suggested diplomatically. They didn't have time for more practice. Outside they could hear the crowd growing louder, more impatient. Someone was banging on the palace doors demanding that Benedict show himself. The transformation had to continue. Next came the makeup. Medieval cosmetics weren't exactly sophisticated. We're talking about lead-based face powder, crushed berries for lip color, charcoal for eye makeup, the kind of beauty products that would horrify modern dermatologists. But they would have to do. The servant applied the makeup with shaking hands, trying to feminize Benedict's distinctly masculine features. Holy Father, you need to stop scowling. Women don't scowl like that. I'm not scowling, Benedict snapped. I'm concentrating. Well, concentrate more femininely. This was not going well. The hair presented another major challenge. Benedict's hair was cut in the distinctive tonsure style of medieval clergy. A bald patch on top of his head surrounded by a ring of hair. This was basically a neon sign advertising, "Religious person here." They solved this problem with a combination of creative styling and strategic head covering. A scarf wrapped just so, positioned to hide the tonsure while framing Benedict's face in a feminine way. From a distance, in dim light, it might actually work. The final touches were the most embarrassing. Medieval women had very different body shapes than men, especially in certain key areas. This required some creative padding. Cloth stuffed in strategic locations, to create curves where nature had provided angles. Benedict stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his fake breasts, while his servant offered helpful critiques. Perhaps a bit less on the left side, Holy Father. You're listing. This was probably the lowest moment in papal history, but it was about to get much lower, because now came the real test. Benedict had to learn how to act like a woman, how to speak in a higher voice, how to behave submissively in a world where women were expected to be seen and not heard, how to blend into a crowd instead of commanding it. For someone with his personality, this was like asking a lion to pretend to be a sheep. Remember, Holy Father, the servant whispered as they prepared to leave. You are no longer the Pope. You are just another Roman woman, trying to get home safely. Keep your head down, your voice soft, your opinions to yourself. Benedict nodded, then caught himself nodding too aggressively. Even his nods were too papal. This was going to be the longest night of his life, and the most humiliating. But as the sounds of the angry crowd grew closer, he realized it was also his only chance of survival. The Pope was about to become a drag queen, and Rome was about to witness the most bizarre escape in religious history. Now let your mind follow our cross-dressing Pope as he steps into the Roman night. The most surreal escape in history is about to begin. Picture Benedict IX, barely recognizable in his makeshift feminine disguise, taking his first terrifying steps outside the papal palace. His heart pounding so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. His fake breasts threatening to shift out of place with every nervous breath. His servant had mapped out a route through Rome's narrowest, darkest streets. away from the main squares where crowds were still chanting for the Pope's head. The plan was simple. Move slowly. Stay in the shadows. Avoid eye contact. Act like just another Roman woman making her way home after a long day. Simple in theory. Terrifying in practice. The first challenge came immediately. Benedict had to walk past a group of papal guards. His own men, who had been stationed at a side entrance to the Vatican. Guards who had seen him every day for months. Who knew his face better than anyone. As he approached them, dressed as a woman, Benedict felt his knees shaking. One wrong move. One suspicious glance. One moment of recognition. And his escape would be over before it started. He kept his head down, pulled his scarf forward to shadow his face, and walked past them with tiny, feminine steps. The guards barely looked at him. To them he was just another woman. Invisible. Irrelevant. Was working. For the first time in hours, Benedict allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe this insane plan might actually succeed. But his relief was premature. Because Rome that night was filled with people looking for the Pope. And some of them were a lot more observant than distracted guards. As Benedict made his way through the narrow streets, he could hear conversations in the darkness. People discussing where the Pope might be hiding. Speculating about escape routes. Planning searches of buildings and secret passages. Several times he had to duck into doorways or alleys to avoid groups of armed men patrolling the streets. Each time he pressed himself against cold stone walls. Trying to make himself as small and invisible as possible. Trying not to think about what would happen if they found him. The most dangerous moment came when he reached the Tiber River. The ancient bridge he needed to cross was crowded with people. Romans heading home from the day's protests. Merchants trying to transport goods despite the chaos. Soldiers maintaining some semblance of order. It was exactly the kind of crowd where a person might be recognized. Benedict had no choice but to join the crowd on the bridge. To walk among the very people who wanted him dead. He pulled his scarf tighter, hunched his shoulders, and shuffled forward with the smallest, most feminine steps he could manage. Halfway across the bridge, disaster nearly struck. A woman walking beside him turned and smiled. "Terrible night, isn't it, sister?" she said cheerfully. "All this fuss about that awful Pope. I hope they catch the little worm and give him what he deserves." Benedict's blood turned to ice. This woman was expecting a response. A conversation. About himself. With himself. While he was disguised as someone else. He had to say something. But his voice, his distinctly masculine, papal voice, would give him away immediately. He managed a weak smile, nodded sympathetically, and made a soft humming sound that he hoped conveyed agreement without revealing his identity. The woman seemed satisfied with this response. "Exactly," she continued. "Men like that give all Christians a bad name. I just pray they find him soon." Benedict hummed again, this time with genuine feeling, because he was praying exactly the same thing. Except he was praying they wouldn't find him at all. Step by terrifying step, Benedict the Ninth crossed Rome. The city he had ruled from his palace, now ruled him from the shadows. Every doorway could hide enemies. Every conversation could expose him. Every moment could be his last. But somehow, against all odds, the most ridiculous escape plan in papal history was actually working. As you drift deeper into this nail-biting escape, picture our cross-dressing Pope navigating the most dangerous part of his journey. Benedict the Ninth was about to discover that looking like a woman was only half the battle. Acting like one under pressure was an entirely different challenge. And he was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. The first near disaster happened at a tavern. Benedict had been walking for hours. His feet were killing him. Medieval women's shoes weren't designed for long-distance papal escapes. He was exhausted, dehydrated, and desperately needed to rest. But when he approached a public tavern for water, he realized he had a problem. He had no money. Popes don't carry cash. That's what servants are for. But servants weren't part of this escape plan. Benedict found himself in the awkward position of being a broke drag queen, with no way to pay for even basic supplies. He was forced to approach the tavern keeper, a burly Roman man who looked like he could snap a pope in half, let alone a pope disguised as a woman. "Please, sir," Benedict whispered in his highest voice, "might I have just a sip of water? I have no coins, but—" The tavern keeper studied him suspiciously. "No coins? What kind of woman travels at night with no money? You running from something? Someone?" Benedict's heart stopped. This was exactly the kind of question he couldn't answer honestly. He forced a nervous laugh. "Oh no, sir. Just trying to get home to my husband. He'll be worried." The tavern keeper's expression softened slightly. Where's home then? Benedict panicked. He didn't know the names of any ordinary Roman neighborhoods. He only knew the wealthy districts where nobles lived, where a common woman definitely wouldn't belong. Near the old market, he stammered, hoping that was vague enough to be believable. The tavern keeper grunted, gave him a cup of water, and waved him away. But Benedict caught him watching suspiciously as he left. That had been way too close. The second near miss was even worse. Benedict was hurrying through a residential district when he heard footsteps behind him. Getting closer. Getting faster. Someone was following him. He tried to walk casually. But the footsteps matched his pace exactly. When he sped up, they sped up. When he slowed down, they slowed down. Someone was definitely tracking him. Benedict's mind raced. Had he been recognized? Was this one of the searchers? Should he run? Should he hide? Should he try to brazen it out? The footsteps were getting closer. Benedict could hear breathing behind him. Heavy, determined, threatening. Finally, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Benedict nearly screamed, but he caught himself just in time. Turned around slowly, prepared for the worst. It was a Roman city guard. Armed. Official. Looking very serious. You there, woman? The guard said firmly. I need to ask you some questions. Benedict's legs turned to jelly. This was it. The end of his escape. The end of his life. He tried to keep his voice steady. Feminine. Innocent. Yes, sir? The guard studied his face in the torchlight. Benedict was sure his makeup was smudging. That his masculine features were showing through. That his disguise was falling apart under scrutiny. You matched the description of someone we're looking for, the guard said slowly. Benedict's blood turned to ice. They had descriptions of him. Even in disguise. Even as a woman. His cross-dressing escape plan had failed. But then the guard continued. A woman who stole bread from the market earlier today. Short, dark hair. About your size. Benedict almost laughed with relief. They weren't looking for the Pope. They were looking for a female bread thief. Someone completely different. Someone who just happened to match his current appearance. Oh no, sir, Benedict said in his most innocent voice. I've been home all day. With my family. I'm just trying to get back there now. The guard looked skeptical. But he had no real evidence. And he had bigger problems than petty theft. Like finding the missing Pope. Move along then, he grumbled. But stay out of trouble. Benedict nodded gratefully. And hurried away before the guard could change his mind. 3 times he had almost been caught. 3 times luck had saved him. But Benedict was beginning to realize that his disguise was far from perfect. And Rome was full of people looking for someone. Even if they weren't sure exactly who. Let your mind drift into the early morning hours as our cross-dressing Pope finally approaches safety. After hours of terror, narrow escapes, and the most humiliating night of his life, Benedict IX was about to discover that sometimes the most ridiculous plans actually work. The safe house was a modest villa on the outskirts of Rome, owned by distant relatives who had remained loyal to the Tusculani family. Despite everything. Despite the corruption. Despite the scandal. Despite the fact that their Pope was currently dressed as a woman and sneaking through Rome like a common criminal. Family loyalty in medieval Italy ran deeper than political embarrassment. Benedict approached the villa just as dawn was breaking over the Roman hills. His feet were bleeding from walking in women's shoes. His makeup was smudged beyond recognition. His fake breasts had shifted so many times that he looked like he had a severe medical condition. But he was alive. And he was free. For the moment. The villa's gate was locked. Benedict knocked softly, trying not to wake the entire neighborhood. After several anxious minutes, a sleepy servant appeared, took one look at the strange woman standing at the gate, and started to close the door. Wait, Benedict whispered urgently. I'm here to see Lord Marcus. Tell him his cousin needs sanctuary. The servant looked confused. Lord Marcus has no female cousins, woman. You must be mistaken. Benedict realized his disguise was too good. Even his own family wouldn't recognize him like this. He had to partially reveal his identity, which was terrifying, but necessary. Please, he whispered, tell him Theophylactus is here. He'll understand. The servant's eyes widened. Theophylactus was Benedict's real name, known only to family members. This strange woman somehow knew papal family secrets. The servant hurried inside, returned with Lord Marcus himself. A middle-aged man who had been loyally supporting his papal cousin despite increasing doubts about his behavior. Marcus took one look at the figure in women's clothing. squinted in the dim light, and his jaw dropped. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," he whispered. "Benedict? Is that really you?" Benedict nodded miserably. "Can we please continue this conversation inside? Before someone sees us." Marcus quickly ushered him into the villa, closed and locked the door behind them, then turned to stare at his papal cousin in complete amazement. "I heard rumors that you'd escaped the Vatican," Marcus said slowly, "but nobody mentioned this." He gestured at Benedict's feminine attire. "It was the only way," Benedict said defensively. "Nobody looks twice at women. They're invisible." Marcus walked around him, taking in the full scope of the transformation. The dress, the makeup, the padding, the complete humiliation of papal authority. This is either the most brilliant escape plan in history, or the most ridiculous thing anyone has ever done. "Why can't it be both?" Benedict asked, and for the first time in hours he actually smiled, because he had done it. Against all odds, against all logic, against all dignity, he had escaped. The most powerful man in medieval Europe had successfully fled his enemies by dressing as a woman. It was absurd. It was humiliating. It was completely contrary to everything the papacy represented. And it had worked perfectly. Marcus provided him with food, clean clothes, a chance to wash off the makeup and remove the padding, to transform back from fugitive drag queen to former pope. But as Benedict cleaned himself up, he realized something disturbing. This wasn't the end of his problems. This was just the beginning. He might have escaped Rome, but he was still a pope without a city, a leader without followers, a man whose only claim to power now rested on the fact that he'd successfully run away dressed as a woman, which wasn't exactly the kind of papal legacy that inspired confidence. Outside the villa walls, Rome was waking up to discover that their pope had vanished during the night. Soon, search parties would be organized, rewards would be offered, every road out of the city would be watched. Benedict IX had won the first round of his escape, but the game was far from over, and his enemies were just getting started. Now, as you settle into this incredible aftermath, picture Rome waking up to the most embarrassing news in papal history. The citizens who had spent all night surrounding the Vatican, demanding their pope show himself, were about to discover that their target had literally slipped away in the night, dressed as a woman, and nobody had noticed. The first sign that something was wrong came when the morning shift of protesters arrived at St. Peter's Square. They expected to find the same angry crowds from the night before, the same guards protecting the papal palace, the same tense standoff between pope and people. Instead they found confusion, uncertainty, and a very suspicious silence from inside the Vatican walls. The crowd began demanding answers. "Where is he?" they shouted at the remaining papal guards. "Bring out the corrupt pope. Let him face his people." But the guards looked nervous, evasive, like they were hiding something important. Because they were. Some of them had discovered Benedict's empty chambers hours earlier. They had searched the Vatican thoroughly, checked every hiding place, every secret passage, every possible location where a pope might conceal himself. Nothing. Benedict IX had vanished completely. The guards were too embarrassed to admit this publicly. How do you tell an angry mob that you've lost track of the pope? That the most important person in your care has somehow disappeared? That you've failed at the one job you were specifically hired to do? So they stalled, made excuses, claimed that the pope was praying privately and couldn't be disturbed. But the crowd wasn't buying these explanations. Romans knew papal behavior patterns. They knew Benedict didn't pray privately. He barely prayed publicly. Something was definitely wrong. By mid-morning, the truth started leaking out. Servants began whispering to their friends. Guards confided in their families. The secret of Benedict's escape spread through Rome like wildfire. And the people's reaction was complicated. Part of the crowd was furious. They felt cheated, robbed of their righteous confrontation. They had prepared for a dramatic showdown between corrupt pope and angry citizens. Instead, they got the medieval equivalent of a magic trick. Their target had simply vanished. "Coward," people shouted at the empty papal palace. "Face us like a man." The irony of that particular demand would become apparent later. But part of the crowd was also impressed, confused, almost grudgingly admiring. Nobody had expected this outcome. Popes were supposed to be dignified, authoritative. They were supposed to face their problems with papal gravitas, not sneak away in the night like common criminals. The fact that Benedict had chosen such a humiliating escape route was almost worse than his corruption. But it was also kind of brilliant. As the day wore on and more details emerged, the story became increasingly unbelievable. People heard rumors about women's clothing, makeup, disguises. At first, nobody believed these stories. They were too ridiculous, too contrary to everything papal authority represented. But the evidence kept mounting. Servants who had seen the transformation, guards who remembered strange women walking past their posts, citizens who recalled odd conversations with suspicious feminine figures. Slowly, incredibly, the full truth began to emerge. The Pope had escaped dressed as a woman. The spiritual leader of the Catholic Church had become a cross-dressing fugitive. The man who was supposed to represent divine masculine authority had saved his life by embracing his feminine side. Rome didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The reactions were as varied as the population itself. Some people were scandalized beyond belief. This was sacrilege on an unprecedented scale, a complete mockery of everything the papacy represented. Others found it hilarious. The corrupt boy pope who had tormented them for years had been reduced to sneaking around in women's clothing. It was poetic justice. Still others were simply confused. How was this even possible? How had nobody noticed? How had the most recognizable man in Rome walked through the city dressed as a woman without being discovered? But perhaps most telling was what happened next. Instead of organizing pursuit parties to drag Benedict back to Rome, many Romans simply moved on. The immediate crisis was over. The corrupt pope was gone. Sure, he'd escaped in the most humiliating way imaginable, but he was still gone. And that's what really mattered. Rome had successfully revolted against papal corruption. The method of victory was unconventional, but victory nonetheless. As you drift deeper into this incredible story, let your mind follow the aftermath of the most embarrassing papal escape in history. Because Benedict IX's cross-dressing adventure was just the beginning of his problems, not the end. You might think that any reasonable person would take this experience as a sign from God. That maybe, just maybe, being pope wasn't working out. That perhaps it was time to retire quietly to a monastery, spend the rest of his days in humble prayer and reflection. Maybe write an autobiography titled, My Life as a Drag Queen Pope. But Benedict IX was not a reasonable person. He was a spoiled, arrogant, completely delusional young man who genuinely believed that God wanted him to be pope, despite all evidence to the contrary. So instead of accepting defeat gracefully, Benedict decided that his humiliating escape was just a temporary setback, a minor inconvenience on his path back to papal glory. He was going to return to Rome, reclaim his throne, and pretend that the whole cross-dressing incident had never happened. This was not a good plan. The Romans had moved on remarkably quickly after Benedict's escape. They elected a new pope, Sylvester III, a man who was basically everything Benedict wasn't. Older, wiser, actually interested in religious matters, and completely lacking in any desire to throw lavish parties using church funds. Sylvester was boring, which was exactly what Rome needed after years of Benedict's chaos. But Benedict couldn't accept that his replacement was better than him, so he began plotting his comeback. From his exile outside Rome, he started gathering supporters. This was harder than expected. Most of his former allies had decided that supporting a pope who had fled the city dressed as a woman was bad for their political careers. Shockingly, Benedict was forced to rely on family connections and increasingly desperate promises. He offered church positions to anyone who would help him. He promised wealth beyond imagination. He even allegedly offered to share the papacy with potential supporters, which isn't actually how the papacy works. But Benedict had never been big on theological details. After months of planning and bribing, Benedict felt ready for his grand return. He gathered what passed for an army, really just a collection of mercenaries, family retainers, and people who owed his relatives money, and marched on Rome, demanding that the Romans recognize him as their rightful pope. The Romans' response was swift and decisive. They laughed at him. Literally, citizens lined the walls of Rome, pointing at Benedict's small army, making jokes about whether he was wearing women's clothing under his armor. Some people brought dresses to wave at him mockingly. Others shouted suggestions for makeup colors that would complement his complexion. The humiliation was complete. But Benedict was nothing if not persistent. When direct military action failed, he tried political maneuvering. He appealed to other European leaders, claimed that his escape had been a strategic retreat, that he was the legitimate pope and Sylvester was a usurper. Some foreign rulers were sympathetic, not because they believed Benedict's claims, but because papal politics were always useful for their own schemes. With external support, Benedict actually managed to return to Rome briefly in 1045. For about 2 months there were technically two popes, Benedict IX and Sylvester III, both claiming divine authority, both excommunicating each other, both insisting they were God's chosen representative. It was religious chaos. But Benedict's second reign was even worse than his first. Romans remembered exactly why they had revolted against him: his corruption, his arrogance, his complete lack of qualification for papal office. And now they also remembered his humiliating escape. He had lost all credibility, all authority, all respect. By early 1046, Benedict was forced to flee Rome again, this time without the benefit of women's clothing. He was just a regular fugitive, running for his life from people who were tired of his nonsense. And this time there would be no dramatic comeback. Benedict IX had proven that even popes have limits, that divine authority means nothing without popular support, and that sometimes the most humiliating defeat teaches the most important lessons. Though in Benedict's case he never seemed to learn anything at all. As you let your mind drift into the long-term consequences of this incredible story, picture medieval Europe slowly learning about the Pope who escaped dressed as a woman. Because in an age before internet or social media, Benedict IX was about to become something unprecedented. The world's first viral papal scandal. The story of his cross-dressing escape spread across Europe like wildfire. Medieval people loved gossip almost as much as modern people do. And this wasn't just any gossip. This was gossip about the Pope, the supposedly infallible representative of God on earth, who had saved his life by putting on makeup and fake breasts. It was the kind of story that medieval chroniclers couldn't resist recording. Even the most serious religious historians felt compelled to document this unprecedented event. Not because it was theologically important, but because it was simply too bizarre to ignore. Monks copying manuscripts would add little marginal notes about the cross-dressing Pope. Troubadours began composing songs about papal drag queens. The story became a staple of medieval entertainment. Benedict IX had achieved a very special kind of immortality. He was remembered, not for any religious achievements, not for theological insights, not for moral leadership, but for being the Pope who wore women's clothing to escape an angry mob. It was the ultimate irony. Benedict had spent his entire papacy trying to be memorable for his wealth and power. Instead, he became unforgettable for his humiliation. The story took on a life of its own as it spread. Each retelling added new details. Some true, some exaggerated, some completely fictional. By the time the tale reached distant kingdoms, Benedict wasn't just wearing women's clothing. He was allegedly wearing jewelry, perfume, dancing through the streets of Rome like a medieval drag performer. The truth was embarrassing enough, but the legend was absolutely devastating. For the Catholic Church, Benedict's legacy presented a serious problem. How do you maintain papal authority when one of your popes became famous for cross-dressing? How do you claim divine infallibility when your leader's most notable achievement was successfully pretending to be a woman? The Church tried several approaches to managing this embarrassment. Some officials attempted to suppress the story entirely, to remove it from official records, to pretend it had never happened. But you can't suppress a story this entertaining. Other church leaders tried to reframe the narrative, to present Benedict's escape as evidence of divine protection. God had provided him with a miraculous disguise to preserve his life. This interpretation convinced absolutely nobody. Most people recognized divine intervention when they saw it. And cross-dressing popes didn't qualify. Eventually, the Church settled on a different strategy. They used Benedict IX as a cautionary tale. An example of what happens when papal authority is abused, when corruption goes too far, when spiritual leaders forget their responsibilities to their flock. Benedict became the poster child for everything that was wrong with the medieval papacy. But even this strategy backfired somewhat, because the story was too entertaining to be truly cautionary. People enjoyed hearing about the cross-dressing Pope. They laughed at his adventures. They shared the tale as comedy rather than tragedy. Benedict had become medieval Europe's first religious meme. And like all good memes, his story refused to die. Centuries later, when church reformers wanted to criticize papal corruption, they would invoke Benedict IX. When political opponents wanted to embarrass the Vatican, they would remind people about the Pope who fled in women's clothing. When ordinary citizens wanted to deflate religious pomposity, they would share stories about papal drag queens. Benedict's legacy became a permanent part of European culture. A reminder that even the most powerful religious authorities are fundamentally human, subject to fear, capable of humiliation, and occasionally forced to put on dresses to save their lives. In trying to escape his immediate problems, Benedict IX had created a much larger, more lasting problem. He had proven that papal dignity was negotiable, that divine authority could be mocked, that even God's chosen representatives sometimes had to embrace their feminine side to survive. It was a lesson that would echo through European history for centuries to come. Now, as you settle into the final stretch of this incredible tale, let's take a moment to really appreciate what we've just witnessed. Because Benedict IX's cross-dressing escape reveals something profound about human nature. Something that's both hilarious and oddly comforting. When you strip away all the medieval pageantry, all the religious authority, all the political power, what you're left with is a scared young man, putting on a dress, because he was terrified of facing the consequences of his actions. And honestly, that's the most relatable thing any pope has ever done. Think about it. How many times in your life have you wanted to put on a disguise and run away from your problems? Benedict IX just happened to have the resources, and the desperation, to actually do it. He turned a universal fantasy into papal reality. The man basically invented the concept of fake it till you make it. Except his version was dress like a woman till you escape the angry mob, which is significantly more specific. But weirdly inspiring? Consider the logistics for a moment. This was 1045. There was no YouTube makeup tutorial for how to transform your pope into a convincing medieval woman. No WikiHow article on papal cross-dressing for beginners. Benedict and his servant had to figure this out from scratch, using medieval cosmetics, which were basically poisonous face paint. And somehow they pulled it off well enough to fool an entire city of people who wanted the pope dead. That's either impressive problem-solving skills, or the medieval Romans had terrible eyesight. Probably both. But here's what really gets me about this story. Benedict IX wasn't just any random guy who decided to dress in drag. He was literally the most important religious figure in the Western world. The supposed voice of God on earth. The spiritual leader of millions of people. And his brilliant solution to a political crisis was to raid the women's wardrobe section. Imagine if this happened today. Picture the Pope having a Twitter meltdown, then announcing he was transitioning. Not for personal identity reasons, but purely as an escape strategy. The internet would break. Social media would collapse. Theological debates would rage for centuries. But somehow Benedict IX managed to do essentially the same thing. With medieval technology. And barely anyone batted an eye. Well, they batted eyes eventually. But it took them a while to process what had happened. What I love most about this story is how it reveals that powerful people are just as ridiculous as everyone else. Maybe more ridiculous. Because they have the resources to act on their most absurd impulses. Regular people fantasize about dramatic escapes. Powerful people actually attempt them. Using papal makeup budgets and Vatican costume departments. Benedict's story also proves that sometimes the most desperate plans are the most effective ones. Any conventional escape route would have been obvious, predictable, easily blocked by his enemies. But nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. And nobody expected papal drag performance art. The sheer audacity of the plan made it work. Plus, it reveals something fascinating about medieval gender roles. Benedict's escape succeeded because women were essentially invisible in 11th century society. They weren't considered threats, weren't searched as thoroughly, weren't questioned as suspiciously. Benedict accidentally discovered the medieval equivalent of hiding in plain sight. By embracing the social invisibility of women, which is either brilliant strategic thinking, or accidental feminism, depending on your perspective. The best part is that Benedict's cross-dressing adventure actually changed history. Not in any grand sweeping way, but in a wonderfully specific way. He proved that papal authority was fundamentally ridiculous. That religious power was just human power wearing fancy costumes. That divine leadership was subject to the same fears and embarrassments as everyone else. He accidentally democratized the papacy by showing that even popes sometimes have to put on dresses and run for their lives, which is honestly the most human thing any religious leader has ever done. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Benedict IX, the Pope who proved that when life gets really difficult, sometimes the best solution is to embrace your feminine side, put on some makeup, and walk confidently past your enemies. It might not solve all your problems, but it'll definitely give you a story that people will remember for 1,000 years. As you begin to drift towards sleep, let me leave you with a tantalizing thought. Benedict IX wasn't the only pope in history to do completely insane things. He was just the one who happened to have the best costume designer. The papal throne has been occupied by some of the most bizarre, scandalous, and downright unbelievable characters in human history, and their stories make Benedict's cross-dressing adventure look almost normal by comparison. Almost. Take Pope John XII, for instance. This was a man who turned the papal palace into what historians politely call a brothel, but was really more like a medieval fantasy football league. Except instead of fantasy football, it was fantasy adultery. With real adultery. John XII allegedly had affairs with his own niece. He ordained a 10-year-old boy as a bishop. He sold church positions to fund his gambling habits. And when church officials complained about his behavior, he had them beaten, sometimes to death. Benedict IX's corruption suddenly seems almost quaint by comparison. Or consider Pope Sergius III, who murdered his predecessor, then dug up the corpse of another previous pope, put the dead body on trial, found it guilty of various crimes, and had it thrown into the Tiber River, because apparently medieval popes believed in posthumous justice, with a side of necrophilia. The trial itself was called the Cadaver Synod, which sounds like a death metal band, but was actually a real religious ceremony, involving a decomposing pope, and a lot of very serious theological discussions about corpse law. Then there's Pope Stephen VI, who was so paranoid about his legitimacy that he actually dug up his predecessor's corpse, dressed it in papal robes, put it on trial for various crimes, and when the corpse was found guilty, had it mutilated and thrown into the Tiber River. This happened twice, because apparently once wasn't enough. Medieval popes really had a thing about putting dead people on trial. It was like their version of reality television, except with more corpses and fewer commercial breaks. But perhaps my personal favorite is Pope Joan, who may or may not have existed, but whose legend is too entertaining to ignore. According to medieval sources, Joan was a woman who disguised herself as a man, became a scholar, rose through church ranks, and eventually became pope, for 2 years, before being discovered when she gave birth during a papal procession. The legend says she was either stoned to death by angry Romans, or quietly retired to a convent, depending on which version you prefer. The Catholic Church officially denies that Pope Joan ever existed, but they also officially denied that popes could be corrupt, so their credibility on papal scandals is questionable. And speaking of questionable papal decisions, there's Pope Benedict VI, not to be confused with our cross-dressing Benedict IX. This Benedict was strangled to death in his own bed by a rival pope, who then took over the papacy, because medieval papal politics were basically Game of Thrones, with more Latin and fewer dragons. Or Pope John XXII, the first one, not the recent saint. This John was deposed by the Council of Constance for simony, perjury, and what the official church records describe as other crimes too numerous and heinous to mention, which in medieval times was saying something, because they mentioned everything, including the really disturbing stuff. Each of these papal stories reveals something fascinating about medieval Christianity, about power, about corruption, about the amazing things people will do when they think God is on their side, and about the even more amazing things they'll do when they discover God might actually be laughing at them. Benedict IX's cross-dressing escape is just one thread in a vast tapestry of papal insanity, a tapestry woven from equal parts religious devotion, political ambition, sexual scandal, and occasional murder, with a surprising amount of corpse-related legal proceedings. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that history is full of stories like Benedict's. Stories of powerful people making terrible decisions, of religious leaders behaving badly, of human nature triumphing over divine pretensions. Stories that remind us that no matter how seriously people take themselves, they're still capable of absolutely ridiculous behavior. Sweet dreams. And remember, if your problems ever seem overwhelming, just ask yourself, what would a cross-dressing medieval pope do? And so we come to the end of our incredible journey through medieval papal history. As you settle into sleep, let's take one final moment to appreciate the absolutely magnificent absurdity of what we've just experienced together. Benedict IX, a young man who started as the most powerful person in medieval Europe, and ended up as history's most famous cross-dressing fugitive. It's a story that perfectly captures everything ridiculous and wonderful about human nature. The arrogance that leads people to believe they're untouchable, the desperation that forces them to try increasingly creative solutions, and the sheer stubborn determination to survive, even when survival requires putting on makeup and fake breasts. What makes Benedict's story truly special isn't just the cross-dressing, though that's admittedly pretty spectacular. It's the fact that his escape plan actually worked. This wasn't a failed attempt at papal drag performance. This was a successful military operation, conducted entirely in women's clothing, by someone who had probably never worn anything more feminine than silk papal slippers. The logistics alone should have doomed the plan. But somehow, against all odds, Benedict managed to walk through an entire city of people who wanted him dead, while wearing a dress, and nobody noticed. It's either the greatest testimony to medieval makeup artistry in history, or proof that angry mobs have terrible attention to detail. As you drift off to sleep, remember that Benedict's story teaches us something important about facing our problems. Sometimes the solution isn't to fight harder, or think more strategically, or gather more resources. Sometimes the solution is to completely abandon your dignity, put on a ridiculous costume, and walk confidently past your enemies like you belong there. It's the medieval equivalent of fake it till you make it, except with significantly more cross-dressing. Benedict IX proved that when conventional solutions fail, unconventional solutions might be your only hope. That when you can't solve your problems as yourself, maybe you need to try solving them as someone else entirely. Someone wearing a completely different outfit, with completely different gender presentation, and a completely different approach to personal safety. His story also reminds us that powerful people are just regular people with better costumes. Strip away the papal regalia, the religious authority, the political connections, and you're left with a scared young man, trying to avoid consequences, using whatever tools he has available, even if those tools happen to be women's clothing and medieval cosmetics. In the end, Benedict IX became legendary not for his power, but for his powerlessness. Not for his authority, but for his vulnerability. Not for his masculine papal strength, but for his feminine escape strategy. He achieved immortality by embracing mortality, dignity by abandoning dignity, and success by accepting humiliation, which is perhaps the most profound lesson any religious leader has ever taught, even if he taught it completely by accident, while wearing a dress. So as you close your eyes tonight, think of Benedict IX, somewhere in medieval Italy, probably still trying to convince people that his cross-dressing adventure was actually a brilliant strategic maneuver, and not just a panic response involving papal cosmetics. Remember that history is full of people who faced impossible situations, and found impossible solutions. People who proved that sometimes the most ridiculous plan is the most effective plan. That sometimes embracing your feminine side is the most masculine thing you can do. And that sometimes the best way to preserve your dignity is to temporarily abandon it entirely. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of history's most entertaining scandals. If you enjoyed drifting off to this bizarre tale of papal drag performance and medieval political intrigue, don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable bedtime stories from the past. Because history is full of people who did absolutely insane things. And I can't wait to share their stories with you. Sweet dreams. And remember, if your problems seem overwhelming tomorrow, just ask yourself what Benedict IX would do. Then probably do something completely different. But maybe keep the makeup tutorial handy, just in case.